Hello, everyone. Welcome to Books Unbanned, Protecting the Freedom to Learn, presented by African American Policy Forum. Please welcome, we have today Kimberlé Crenshaw, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, Michael Harriot, and Dr. Kaye Wise Whitehead moderating.
Good evening, folks. My name is Kaye Wise Whitehead, and I'm a professor of communication in African and African American Studies at Loyola University, Maryland, the national president of the National Women's Studies Association, NWSA, and the host of Today with Dr. K. I have the pleasure of moderating this evening's panel, Books Unbanned, Protecting the Freedom to Learn. This panel officially kicks off a new leg of the African American Policy Forum's Books Unbanned Tour, this time in partnership with the New Republic. Over the next month, the tour will travel to over 13 stops across the country, from Texas, Florida, Missouri, states that really need it, to highlight the alarming spread of censorship that threatens our democracy. We are mindful as we begin that retrenchment comes in waves, and we see it everywhere. Attacks on Black leadership, attacks on Black institutions, discourses about how Black intellectuals that we don't know what we're doing. We have all seen some part of this one way or the other. The piece of the retrenchment that we want to talk about tonight on this panel is happening in the midst of all of this. There is a project of suppression of the actual product, the work that we create, and that project is linked to all the other manifestations of the retrenchment. What we're going to talk about this evening are the conditions of possibility. While Republican politicians try to deceive us by claiming that the crisis is a hoax or it's manufactured, the story from the ground tells a deeply troubling story. In 5,049 schools, in 138 school districts, across 32 states, book bans are suppressing children across this country from learning the full tapestry of American life and history. Because Black history is American history. Overwhelmingly, book banners continue to target stories by and about people of color and LGBTQ+ individuals. PEN America reports that 37% of the United titles that are banned are books about race, racism, or feature characters of color. Meanwhile, 36% of unique titles have banned LGBTQ+ characters or themes. Now, while the scale of these book bans has seemed to pierce the public consciousness, they're still being framed as organic or grassroots or apolitical attacks on knowledge. A closer look at the bans revealed that, to the contrary, there's a coordinated campaign to excise an entire fold of American life. That is, in particular, attacking stories which should contend with the many ways in which this country has been shaped by an often violent and often relevant experience with racial hierarchy. Stories about Ruby Bridges, to MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail, to Toni Morrison piercing prose, our children are being denied access to the essential knowledge that makes sense of the world that they live in and the injustice that they see around them. These racist book bans are not just happening in isolation. They are a part of a twisted web of retrenchment that has seen the dismantling of affirmative action, waves of voter suppression, and political violence. In this time of confusion and chaos, the dots behind all of this must be connected, which is why I am delighted to be hosting this panel today. This panel brings together an astute collection of authors and their books and what our discussion is going to consist of, race and racism, helping us to make sense of this cycle of progress and retrenchment. It is the clear-sightedness that our panelists have that will help us to understand why we are in the crosshairs of censorship and attack. My hope is that our panelists will make sense of all of that for us and help us to chart the ways in which we can get this car back from the cliff that they're trying to take us on. To introduce our esteemed panelists, to my immediate right, who probably needs absolutely no introduction, is Kimberlé Crenshaw, the co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum, the founder and executive director of the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies at Columbia Law School. She is the Isidore and Seville Salzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia Law School and the Promise Institute Professor of Law at UCLA Law School. Professor Crenshaw is the editor of Critical Race Theory, the key writings that form the movement, and the newly released hashtag Say Her Name, Black Women's Stories of Police Violence and Police Silence. Welcome, Professor Crenshaw.
The slave trade, the East African slave trade, different from the Atlantic slave trade, and that the Ottomans and the Egyptians wanted men.
After Professor Crenshaw, who probably also needs no introduction, is Michael Harriot, a columnist at thegrio.com, where he covers the intersection of race, politics, and culture. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, NBC, BET, and I heard it's on his mother's refrigerator. He is a political commentator on MSNBC and CNN. He has been honored by the National Association of Black Journalists for commentary, digital commentary, and TV news writing. He's also the author of Black AF History, the unwhitewashed story of America, which came out last month. Welcome, Mr. Harriot. And last, and certainly not least, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, a National Book Award-winning author of the popular book Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, in addition to 15 books for adults and children, including 9 New York Times bestsellers, 5 of which were #1 New York Times bestsellers. Dr. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University, the director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a CBS News racial justice contributor. Welcome, Dr. Kendi. Please note that right after this panel, the panelists and I will be available to sign our books and be in close contact and discussion with you. So, Professor Crenshaw, let us paint the picture. Now, we've witnessed that the book bans specifically target authors of color and books featuring characters of color. We also know that this has been activated by the disinformation campaign against critical race theory. How widespread is the use of law and authority to spread the ideas of the anti-woke cabal?
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kaye, for that fiery introduction and for all the energy that you've brought to this conversation. The expanse of this attack is difficult for many people to see because it's not really being covered in the media. Here are some things that we need to know. Upwards of 50% of all school children currently go to schools in district states where there is some ban on how the teaching of American history will unfold, specifically bans on ideas that are called divisive concepts. What are these divisive concepts? Divisive concepts include the idea that the Tulsa race riot was actually about race. So imagine trying to teach the Tulsa massacre while denying that it has something to do with racism and white supremacy. Divisive concepts include the idea that Rosa Parks, when she refused to give up her seat on the bus, was fighting something called white supremacy. Imagine what our students learn about our history when the story of Rosa Parks can't be told as a story of a fight against racial subordination. So these laws that have been passed in more than 23 states, according to my colleagues at UCLA Critical Race Forward Project, impact not just students now, But the idea is to impact our future. This is not simply about this moment. It's not about this next election. It is about the next century. If our students cannot learn the truth about the history that they have inherited, about the country that they were born in, if they are unable to name the realities that they exist in, they'll be unable to transform them. And that is the whole point of these laws, to undermine, to interrupt, to prevent anything happening again that was anything like what happened in 2020, when there were protests in every state of the union, the largest protest mobilization in history around racial injustice. So this is going to the heart of our ability to narrate our past and our present in order to transform our future. It's not simply an organic uprising of parents from the ground. This is the use of the state. This is the use of public policy to determine and dictate what kinds of ideas can be expressed, what kinds of histories can be told, and all based on one basic orientation. It is about the comfort, the projected comfort, I have to say, of white school children. It is not about black school children. It's not about other students of color. It's not about queer students. It's about a projected sensibility that anything that makes a certain subgroup uncomfortable cannot be introduced in classrooms today. So it's a major shift to the right. It's one that we don't really grapple with as much as we should, in part because the leader in this is a framework of critical race theory that basically has been distorted and weaponized into a justification for this level of suppression.
Thank you. Let me come to you, actually, Dr. Kendi, because you have the dubious distinction of being included on two extreme lists. You are one of the best-selling authors in the genre, but you're also one of the most frequently targeted authors. Why are your books banned, and then what are they saying about why they have been banned?
Let's see, they've said that, my books have said that selective storytelling. My books have, which to me means that I'm not telling the story through the white gaze. That I'm not telling the story through the white gaze. Stated that it's factually incorrect. That because factually incorrect for them, because facts are white superiority. Facts are white superiority. They've stated that my books stated are talking about a left-wing hoax, which they call racism. A left-wing hoax, which to me means that, the reason why I guess they would say black, the reason why I guess brown and indigenous black people are more likely to be killed by police or incarcerated or more likely to be killed by police or incarcerated or not racism. It's because there's something wrong with them. They claim that my books, they claim that school children, as Kim was saying, white uncomfortable children, as Kim was saying, which means that apparently white school children aren't reading about white school children abolitionists, reading about apparently they're not abolitionists in my books. Apparently they're not. They don't completely erase them and on and on. I mean, these are completely erase them and on. You know, obviously they show their own racist ideas. You know, obviously they show their own racist ideas. They show their own ignorance. My book actually. The book that I did with Jason Reynolds, a YA version of Jason Reynolds, called Stamp, was recently banned in Wilmington, North Carolina. Banned in Wilmington, North Carolina. The person who banned the book claimed that the book was disrespectful to the Bible. Claimed that the book was disrespectful to the Bible. Described and critiqued the curse of ham theory. Described that justified the enslavement of black people. So that justified the enslavement of black people. To the Bible. So that's disrespectful to the Bible.
Mr. Harriot, I now turn to you to complete this portrait of widespread censorship from a journalistic perspective. What is the story that is being told about this in mainstream media?
Well, the story that most of us read, to be clear, is a story of white supremacy, right? So what you read about, for instance, critical race theory, is that scholars from since the late 70s, and I would argue that since Du Bois, had a historically accurate, Du Bois created sociology as we know it. And that the scholarship from Du Bois down to Professor Crenshaw, all of these scholars, these educated people who went to the greatest institutions that America created, you're reading that the things that they did are not true because a white man said so. Now, what I am saying is not just a white man who is a scholar and a historian. No, just a white man. He has no education, no experience. We know who started these bans. We've seen the templates that were passed to state legislatures. We know that the premises that they redefined what, for instance, critical race theory is, based on what a white man said, not a scholar, not an academic, not a historian, not just a white man. That is white supremacy. To stack a white man against a century of scholars is white supremacy. And then, so when you talk about what critical race theory is, you don't know the narrative. Even when they say critical race theory, they're using the white man's definition. And I looked and wrote and investigated the origin story of it, and we know where it came from. We see the sample legislation from the Manhattan Institute. We see when he says, this is what I'm going to do to demonize this area of studies, and then he did it. And so we can't just hold the Moms for Liberty and the white ladies in South Carolina and the governor of Florida without holding the media to be accountable for elevating a white man to the total summary of scholarship of black people in America and saying it ain't worth what this white man said. And that is what we're facing now.
Thank you, Mr. Harriot. Now that we've gotten a sense of what is happening around this country, I want to shift gears to discuss the why. Why are these book bans so alarming, and really get more into understanding this current moment? I want to come back to you, Dr. Kendi. As someone who has written books for a younger audience, how should parents of black and brown children think about the significance of these book bans, particularly in light of the daily wrenching dimensions that our children endure in their schools?
So they're young, black and brown children, young, 3 years old, 5 years old, black and brown 7 years old, 3 years old, 5 years old, coming home 7 years old, their parents and saying, coming home, I want to their parents and saying, their 6-year-old black and brown 6-year-old saying, I want blue eyes. Black and brown children. There are 4-year-old black and brown children. There are saying that I don't like black and brown children. Saying that I don't like they're black and brown children who are coming home. They're black and brown children saying that my skin is thin. And they're black and brown children who are coming home. They're black and brown children saying who are coming home. And what's wrong with saying what's wrong? And it's important for us to understand that. And it's important for us to understand growing up in an atmosphere of growing up in an anti-brown racist ideas that directly and indirectly tell them that there's something wrong with their skin color, there's something wrong with their hair texture, there's something wrong with their people. And if we don't have wrong with their people anti-racist literature, if we don't have in schools, if we pull that literature out from under them, then we're literally exposing out from under them. Then we're literally exposing and of course these ideas are incredibly insidious. And of course these ideas are incredibly insidious. And then as these children get older, and then they become teenagers, children get older. One study recently found that experienced 5 instances of racist discrimination per day. Just to understand the scale per day. For black, just to understand the teenagers. The number of times they're followed by the police, or they're followed by people. The number of times they're followed by the police, in stores, or teachers assume in stores, that they're misbehaving because they're black. That they're misbehaving because they're black. Our young people are experiencing these are things routinely and regularly, and if they don't have routinely and regularly, and if they don't have of racism, then who do you think they're blaming for what's happened to them? Then who do you think they're blaming? And how is that affecting their sense of themselves? Their sense of development. And how is that affecting their sense of self? And so to me, like, this is incredibly And so to me, like, this is incredibly and clearly the people who are snatching these books and clearly the people who are taking this education out of their hands, who are out of our schools do not care about black and brown children. Out of our schools do not care about black and brown children, and they never have.
Thank you. Professor Crenshaw, I come to you because you've been at the forefront of sounding the alarm about this crisis since the first panic about critical race theory emerged in 2020. Has it been alarming to you that so many people with influence claim that they did not see it coming?
Yes. Alarming, disappointing, frightening. This started, I want people to remember back during the debate between Biden and Trump, when Trump was asked to repudiate the Proud Boys, and instead he said, stand by. When people tell you stand by, they're telling you, I got something for you. And about a month later, he gave them something. It was an executive order in which he grouped all of these ideas that are part of the equity infrastructure. Ideas ranging from structural racism, implicit bias, to gender equity, everything under equity. They were all grouped together and framed as race and gender stereotypes. I mean, talk about taking a set of ideas and turning them upside down. And basically saying that none of these ideas could be incorporated into training in the federal government and its contractors. So one thing that is important to recognize, when the federal government adopts a policy and applies it to its contractors, it's huge. It goes not just to offices in Washington, D.C., but even the Urban League that has a lot of federal contracts, or the National Fair Housing Council is subject to this order. So concretely what that meant is that the National Fair Housing Council could not talk about structural racism in the housing industry. I mean, just think about what that means, right? If you can't talk about structural racism in the housing industry, one of the most segregated aspects of our society, then basically you can't do fair housing advocacy. It's just over. Or if you're the Urban League and you can't talk about the wealth gap or the health gap as a structurally embedded set of relationships, you can't do the work that you do. So that executive order told us everything we needed to know about what was coming. Unfortunately, because this was seen as an election or campaign-oriented tactic, most people saw it as just a flash in the pan, something that would fade away, something that when President Biden rescinded the order, we wouldn't have to worry about anymore. And that was a mistake. Because what happened once that horse got out of the barn, it galloped all across the country. So ALEC, if you guys don't know what ALEC is, look it up, American Legislative Council. They basically took that executive order, turned it into a legislative model that then was copied all over the country again and again and again. So this thing that began with a promise to the Proud Boys moved from the far right of American politics into the very center of American government, and now is firmly situated inside the state legislatures of at least 23 states. And here's the other thing that my colleagues at UCLA found. It's not just a red state phenomenon. This is happening at school boards and city councils and county commissioners in blue states. California, the left coast, is a place that has more of these local level initiatives than even Texas, because Texas was able to do it by state law. It's happening in suburbs and in rural areas and in largely white communities across the country. So how do I feel about it? Angry that it took this before people started saying, oh wait, they really mean all of it, right? Not just a small part of it. They're going for the entire enchilada. And now folks are starting to speak back to it. The question is, you know, sometimes there is a such thing as being too late. And the question is, are we too late?
I come to you, Mr. Harriot. While many of us are shaking our heads at the manifold contradictions in this moment, we cannot look the absurdity of the moment. Now, you are the king of pointing out the absurdity embedded in white supremacy. So what stands out for you as kind of that one little piece, the weirdness of it all in this moment?
So I am in New York City talking about people who are opposed to anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is crazy to me. Like, on its face, objectively, that is a crazy thing. And the other thing that is crazy to me is how reluctant we are to say white people. So I have studied, like, a lot of people know that I write about history and are surprised to find out that I am an economist.
When you see,
and when you look at the
you
data,
read about how people are
the most
feeling
common
so,
aspect of
oppressed
all
and
of these
feeling
groups is not their political
to
affiliation.
the
They're
extent that
Republicans
they
and they're
felt
Democrats.
that
They're
the only way that
conservatives
would save
and they're
them
liberals.
would be that a Messiah would
They have
come,
no
and then how
geographic
they rallied
center.
around the man who
It is
said
just
who
white
he
people,
was. And
right?
apparently
Like,
this
that's the
happens-
most
this
common
happens
aspect.
all
To
over the
say
world
who's doing
with
this
oppressed
as
populations.
accurate as possible,
People do
you have to
rally
say
around
white
the
people. And
figure
you can't be
who
afraid to
has
say that.
special power.
Because if you say
Usually
the
these
far
movements
right, then
that
you're leaving
pull
out the
and
people.
usually
If you say the
nothing
far
comes
left,
out of it,
what
because
we
they
see
realize
is
that,
that,
you know,
one, this is
that-
not a
that
grassroots
it
effort,
really doesn't
right?
have any
These
special
are,
power.
we've
It's just
seen
in this case,
investigations that show that these are people who are leading
for quite a long
efforts
period of
and having
time.
meetings. And again, what we talk about these
psychologically and
states
emotionally,
that
people
have,
seem to have this
critical race theory laws, it's not a bunch
desire
of people
to believe
feeding off of each other. All of them
kind
are
of
the exact same
a very
pieces of
idealistic
legislation.
sort
They
of
have
person.
7
There's
basic
a lot of
ideas:
idealism
race,
involved with
sex,
these kind of
ethnicity,
movements. And I
color,
think that is
national
where the
origin
danger is
inherently
because of course
superior, that
humans
one
are
can be
humans, and
oppressive or
if
racist
you take
or
away
sexist,
the practical
subconsciously or
considerations
unconsciously,
and all of that, then it just
there are
it just
people
becomes
who have been
very,
discriminated against because of their race,
people's
color,
following a dream, they're
and so
following
on, right?
an
So
illusion,
these 7
rather
basic
than
principles
the
are
truth
are what they've used
and that is
to
fascinating
define
see in itself, because
critical
it keeps
race theory
repeating itself
across the
over
country.
history.
7
People
identical
follow kind of illusions and
things
follow
that have nothing to do with
characters that they
actual
believe
critical
are
race
special,
theory.
but then it
And so the absurdity of this is that we are here talking about a thing that was created by people who don't know what they're talking about. And we won't say who they are. That it's white people, right? Not conservatives, again, not liberals. The most common denominator in this effort to ban and censor ideas. And that's the important part, right? Ideas that include people, ideas that make people feel like they are part of society, ideas that teach our children how to view society objectively and all people as equals. That idea is being spread across the country by one group of people. And it's absurd that we don't say it, that we believe it, and that it is spread this far. And I agree with Professor Crenshaw. I don't know if it's not too late to pull it back and put it back in the barn.
Thank you so much, Mr. Harriot. So, folks, we've talked about the what. We've talked about the why. We have to get into how this actually happened. And Dr. Kendi, I'll come to you, because Maggie Takuta Hall elevated the challenges facing authors when she refused Scholastic's demand that she remove racism from her book about her grandparents' experience of internment. This flies in the face of the assumptions that many of us have that major publishers are liberal defenders of free speech. As one of the few Black authors within this industry, can you talk a bit about some of the ways in which the industry has been complicit in fostering the censoring of anti-racist ideas and authors of color?
Well, let me give actually a personal example. Well, let me give actually a personal example. Stamped from the beginning, when I went out to get a literary, when I went out to get, I think I was probably rejected by about 75 literary agents. I think I was probably rejected by about 75 literary agents. Then I started working I think we sent it out to about 25. I think we sent it out to publishers. 25. And we got interest from one publishers. Just to give you the sense of, and I suspect that that was pre-anti-wokeism. And so I can only imagine anti-wokeism. What's happening now, particularly for new authors. What's happening now, particularly for new authors who have big ideas, innovative ideas, who are big ideas, pressing us and pushing us to challenge and pushing us to sort of think about things, challenge, in new ways, the ways in which they're censoring themselves, in new ways, the ways in which they're censoring themselves. Because I suspect that some authors recognize the storm, and they're like, I don't know about putting my work out. And they're like, I don't know about putting my work out. And then authors who ultimately submit, and then authors who ultimately get rejected, almost totally just as I get rejected, and almost totally just as I did. Almost all of those editors who rejected me, almost all of those editors, all of the editors rejected me, are like rejecting all of the editors who are liberal, are rejecting authors today. And so I think this is a huge problem. Now I do think and so I think this is a huge problem. Now I do think that now there are Black editors in critical positions in publishing and potentially critical positions in publishing, but they still only represent a fraction. But they still represent a fraction who are engaged in this work. But let's say somehow who are engaged in this work. But let's say somehow you get an editor, you publish a book. Now you actually got to publish your book. Now right? And you have a media culture, right? And you have imagines that these books are controversial. So literally telling the truth controversial is controversial. And so that creates another sort of barrier. And so that creates particularly for another sort of who are trying to break through. Particularly for new authors who are trying to break through.
Thank you. Mr. Harriot, I want to come back to you because like you, I work in the media. And every time I talk about white supremacy on my show, there's always a group of white men from Dundalk who call and say, well, what about Black people? What about your issues? Why don't you give both sides of the story as if there's a Black side to white supremacy? But they want me to talk about both sidesism. So can you talk about how the media has aided and abetted this extremist agenda by practicing both sidesism?
Right, so there's this, in journalism, there's this idea of objectivity that is a white construct, right? And so here's an example. This is the clearest example. Like the first day of journalism class, you're told to always write in active voice. Don't say Michael Harriot was arrested. Say the police arrested Michael Harriot. You get more information because you see there's two facts in there now. The police did something and Michael Harriot went to jail, right? Except when it comes to white people. You'll hear that Black people suffered racism without saying who it was, right? Black people experienced oppression and overcame what, right? Like, so that, to me, that is the clearest example. But I say that to say the ways in which the media, because this idea of objectivity is not just what you include in a story and how you choose to tell that story, but is what you choose to leave out of the story, right? So if you choose to say, Kimberlé Crenshaw said this, And she is, she has every degree that you can hold, and she's been writing about critical race theory, and she's kind of the definitive authoritative figure in this area. And then Christopher Rufo says this, and you don't say that he has no education in any area of education. Mm-hmm. He has no experience in educating people. He has no expertise. Then what you are doing is you're elevating Christopher Rufo to the same level of expertise as someone who's actually a scholar in the area. And if you don't say every time you use the word critical race theory that this is not what it means, then you're perpetuating Christopher Rufo's idea and not the scholar's ideas, right? And that ain't a right-wing effort. That's the liberal media. Mm-hmm. That's the most liberal part of this society. So we can, again, frame it as a right-wing thing, but these ideas are perpetuated by both liberals and conservatives, and you don't even have to subscribe to this conspiracy theory when you can see that in Los Angeles and the New York Times and Texas and Florida, they're all saying the same thing and writing the same laws, and the articles all say the same thing. So we can't start thinking about, we can't continue to think about this as a conservative idea or a liberal idea or something that has both sides. There are not two sides to the truth.
Right.
Right? There are not two sides to a definition. A word, a phrase means something. And you don't have to give a lie as the other side unless you intend to perpetuate the lie or elevate it to the equality of the fact.
Yes.
And that's what we have to understand about this both sidesism that we call objectivity.
Thank you. So Professor Crenshaw, you are a legal scholar, and we have laid out how the publishing industry is guilty. I think Mr. Harriot has pointed out how the media is guilty. But I think there's another guilty party here, because you and I have been working on the Freedom to Learn campaign, which has attempted to expose the ways in which other institutions have abetted this censorship while attempting to profit from the exact knowledge that they're trying to censor. So can you talk about how this dynamic has played out in alarming ways?
Well, I think you're calling on us to talk about the College Board censoring of the African American Studies Advanced Placement course that was created in the opportune moment after the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor uprising created a demand at long last for an AP course on African American Studies. Let's be clear about something. College Board is a $1.5 billion nonprofit. That's just, make of that what you will. Yeah. But, they have a business model, and the business model is making money off of offering advanced placement courses so students can take the course, take a test at the end of the course so they can test out of certain credits in higher education. There have been attempts for a long time to get African American Studies into AP. It was never the right time until the aftermath of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. So paint this picture when we're having, so many corporations saying, we stand with you, Black people, when for a hot period of time, a short period of time, finally, concepts like structural racism and implicit bias and institutional discrimination become hot button issues, and people want to understand it better. They want to understand how, after all these years, we can still stand by and watch a Black man be murdered in front of all of our eyes. How is it? Why is it? What are we supposed to do about it? So there was a demand for knowledge. College Board stepped into that. collected a lot of African American scholars to help create this course. In creating the course, they said, here are some key concepts that are being taught across the country in African American studies. They include things like structural racism. They include things like black feminism, intersectionality. They include moments like these, like Black Lives Matter. So all this stuff goes into the course. Of course, there's a lot of stuff about ancient Kush and, you know, the history, but also the concepts that hold that history and give it meaning for African American people and our broader society in the here and now. So that becomes part of the course. It just so happens that this train is moving along a track that collides with another train called anti-wokeism, collides with the agenda of suppressing these ideas in the name of anti-wokeism. You heard it. Florida is the place where anti-wokeism goes to die. So this course, of course, runs into this train of denial, of suppression. And so there begins a multi-month negotiation between the College Board and Florida about these ideas that they have already identified as ideas that do not live in Florida. So not too surprisingly, the governor of Florida has this chart of all the ideas in this course that will not be taught, and in that chart includes structural racism, queer theory, intersectionality. These are the things DeSantis doesn't like. The College Board goes back and within a couple months comes back with a course that just happens to take out all of those ideas. And they just happen to say, it's not because DeSantis made us do it, we did it because we decided to do it. Eventually that turns out not to be true. It's exposed that there have been negotiations. It is obvious that one of the things that's driving this is the business model. If you can't sell this course in all 50 states, then the investment in the course and the profits are not going to be what they anticipated. So this is the moment of truth. Do you go with a legitimate, inclusive course on Black studies, or do you bow to the demands of, we can call them anything you want to call them. You probably have your own definition of DeSantis and what's happening in Florida, but the question is, do they get to dictate what our history is, what our concepts are? Do they get to determine what should be included in a course? And the College Board basically blinked and said, okay, we'll take this stuff out. Now, of course, at the end of the day, Florida still hasn't adopted the course. At the end of the day, the content has still been removed. It's gone. And let me just make one analogy just to make it clear that this is about anti-Blackness. They tried the same thing with psychology, because in the psychology course, there's information about how gender is socially constructed. But the American Psychological Association and other people with apparently more power than Black people have said, no, you are not going to take this information out of the course, so they backed down. Same with biology. If a state decides we don't want evolution to be taught, it's got to be creationism, College Board says that is not a legitimate course and we're not going to give you credit for it. But when it comes to Black folk, when it comes to our history, when it comes to what enslavement was all about, we don't get to say what our story is. We don't get to determine what our kids get access to. And why? It's because a liberal institution like the College Board has decided to get into the bed with the likes of the DeSantises of the world. So sometimes it's your friends that you have to have that serious conversation with. It's not always the enemy. If the friends would stand firm against this suppression, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
So, yes. So we have talked about the what, the why, and the how. Let's connect these dots, because we've often been taught that those that don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And so, Dr. Kendi, I'll start with you. As a historian who has often written about America's racialized history, is there a historical moment from your book, stamped from the beginning, that speaks to where we are at this moment?
There's many. And in many ways, these white people who are banning books, white people who are banning people, banning books, who are banning theories and fields, banning really their theories and fields, their ancestors, their ideological ancestors, their ancestors, strategic ancestors were enslavers and strategic segregationists. The original book segregationists were enslavers. Original book and in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, more and more anti-slavery literature, more and more was produced. There was more and more book bans, and that was everything. There was more and more book bans. David Walker's radical appeal to the colored citizens of the world in 1829, when he urged the world in 1829, when he urged throw off the yoke of slavery violently if necessary, yoke of slavery, even Uncle Tom's Cabin, to that even in the end told black people you need to go back to Africa. That and everything in between was banned, and everything in between by enslavers was banned by transition to the Jim Crow era. Transition. We of course remember the ways in which black bodies were segregated out, but black stories were segregated out too. But black books were segregated out of these black books were segregated out of these. And ironically, it was imagined that desegregation. It was imagined that desegregation would be harmful to who? It's the same argument. White children. That they're using today. It's the same segregating of knowledge, that the desegregating of literature, that the desegregating of thought, of literature, are somehow harmful to white children. And I think it's important for us to white children. And I think it's important for us to also really recognize for the first 60 to 70 years, for the first 60 to 70 years, after the fear-mongering was around was around people, their presence, their excellence, their striving. People, their presence, their excellence, their striving was harmful. Then it flipped. Women. During the early era of Jim Crow, and we're still in the period in which now they're saying it's harmful to white children. In which now they're saying it's harmful to the irony about the notion about. It was the notion that anti-racism is harmful to white children. Is harmful to when we're living in a moment is when white children are being targeted online by white supremacists, being targeted online who are actively trying to woo them into actively trying to woo them into, and we're also removing literature that allows them to identify and recognize white supremacists. But then the very people who claim they care about white children are removing that literature, claiming that they protect them. Just like you had a century ago, the very white men who were claiming they were seeking to protect white women were controlling their sexuality. White women were controlling their sexuality. Ultimately, and so I think that, Michael and I were talking earlier about how, Michael and I were talking earlier about how of this moment, like in previous moments, of this moment, like in previous moments, many white folks do not understand their own history. Many white folks and they don't understand that there was a such thing as a white abolitionist or white civil rights. There was a such thing as a white abolitionist, or the ways in which there were 5 million poor, or the ways in which non-slaveholding whites who were driven non-slaveholding whites driven into the Confederate Army to fight a war for enslavers. Like they don't know to fight a war, and they're still being enslavers. Like they don't know today, and so and that's the irony. And so there's so much historical parallel. And that's the irony. Enslavers did not want public schools. Enslavers did not want public libraries. Did not want public schools. They did not want. When we look at the attacks, they did not want. When we look at the attacks, this is the enslavers' lives. And those enslavers almost drove this country, and those enslavers into oblivion. Almost drove this country and white folks who would have been driven into the oblivion, and white folks who would have been driven into the oblivion are lifting them up.
Let me ask you, Professor Crenshaw. Thank you so much, Dr. Kendi. Let me ask you, Professor Crenshaw. How does a historical lens illuminate why it's important for us to act illuminate why it's important for us to act in this moment rather than to be complicit?
Well, you know, there's so much that Ibram has put on the table that, you know, basically tells us we've seen this story before. We know how this story ends, right? And now we have the opportunity to write a different ending to it. The historical piece that I want to lift up is it comes from the law of who can give testimony. There was a time when black folks couldn't testify against white folks. Actually, the idea was that one of the privileges of whiteness is never having to be accountable to anyone that didn't look like you. And in fact, the early efforts to eliminate those disabilities were framed as reverse discrimination because it was taking something away, a privilege from white people. And one of the most interesting cases that I teach is the question of, all right, was this a disability, a legal disability, just against black people with respect to everyone else, or was it against all non-whites against white people? And in a case, California basically said one of the privileges of whiteness is that you do not have to be subject to the testimony of any non-white person. Now, think about the extent to which what we are experiencing right now is precisely that. If we think about our ideas, our histories, our narratives, our stories, that is our testimony. That is our story. And effectively, not even effectively, they are actually saying the comfort of whiteness, the comfort of white children. And now that it's expanded to diversity programs in corporate America, the comfort of white people is such that they are protected against these stories, narratives, and realities that make them feel uncomfortable. Now, I just want to be clear about one thing. I'm not saying that all white people are uncomfortable by this stuff. In fact, I'm saying that a true history, and I'm signing on to what everybody has been saying here, a true and inclusive history would say that there have been white people across our history who are not only not uncomfortable, they are willing to die for the idea of equity, to die for the idea of a true multiracial society. They're being erased from this history as well. So when I think about the history that's being erased, I see that erasure as the condition of possibility for this moment and the next moment. At the end of the day, the Union did win the Civil War, but the Daughters of the Confederacy won the narrative war. That's why we're still having this conversation. Those little white ladies who said, you know what, my pappy didn't die for nothing. I am going to make sure that our story is going to be projected well into the future. Well, this is part of the story. The idea that they fought for states' rights not to maintain enslavement, the idea that enslavement was actually good for black people. Where did we hear that recently? So if you wonder where these ideas are coming from, it's only because the actual history out of which they come hasn't even been taught to most people. They're fighting about just the beginnings of being able to tell these histories. If we don't see in that effort to say we need to be clear that enslavement actually provided skills, if we don't hear in that the logic of the Confederacy, it's because we have not been taught the logic of the Confederacy. So this is telling us that if we don't fight this now with everything we've got, we're not just losing this next election. This is going to project well into the next century in the same way the Daughters of Confederacy have to be dancing wherever they are, because their vision of America is front and center right here, right now.
And our last question, just very quickly, since we're here to celebrate books, I would like to have either of the authors just give us one little piece of inside information about your book. I'll start with Michael Harriot, a columnist at thegrio.com. He's the author of Black AF History, the Unwhitewashed Story of America.
So, Black AF history, I think, throughout, there's been a litany of books written by black people and about black history. And there's been a litany of history books that are usually, we call them American history, that are usually written through the white lens, if we're being honest. There are French people and English colonists and pilgrims, and all those people have religious and economic and political motivations, and then the black people are just slaves. The indigenous people are just Indians. So what I wanted to do is write a book about America through the eyes of white people, not black people. Through the eyes of black people. Not a book about black people, but a book about the history of this country as black people saw it. And so that's what Black AF history is, because one of the things that I contend is that they're not trying to ban black history, they're trying to ban white history. They don't care if you talk about, the civil rights movement saying, we shall overcome. As long as you don't talk about what they overcome, you can learn about slavery, but not about what the enslavers did. You can learn about the founding fathers, but not about how they, like George Washington, chased on a judge and enslaved woman down until the day he died, that Thomas Jefferson never freed an enslaved person in his life, but somehow he has this reputation as an anti-slavery abolitionist. So they don't care about you learning what black people did. They don't want you to learn the white history, and that's why I wrote Black AF history.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, National Book Award-winning author of the popular book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. One little insight for us,
So
please.
I wanted to write a book. So I wanted to write a book us to understand the origins anti-black racist ideas, anti-black ideas that I find anti-black racist ideas that I find are common sense in too many cases. And I think that these ideas are so insidious, so widespread, these ideas are so that I think it's hard for people to understand that people actually created these ideas. That there was a time in which created these ideas. People did not actually think people with darker skin were lazy. People did not actually think people with darker skin were lazy. And so I wanted to really write a book that really named names. And so I wanted to really write a book who created these names of precisely and then why did they create these ideas? And we have been taught why did they create these ideas? This history that we have been taught people created that anti-black racist ideas because they were ignorant, anti-black racist ideas because they were ignorant. They just didn't know they were hateful, or they just didn't like black people. But or they just when you actually didn't like black people, but the producers of anti-black racist ideas, you find that these were anti-black racist ideas producing these ideas, typically to justify producing these ideas, existing racist policies. That benefited them. In other words, I'm enslaving black folks. I'm making a tremendous amount of money enslaving them. There are people who are making a tremendous amount of money enslaving them. So I'm going to basically convince those folks, as well as black people, that they should be enslaved, as well as black people, that they should be enslaved. And so that relationship of really the power and relationship coming before the ideas, power is really what I wanted to show. Before the ideas is really what I wanted to show in this book.
Thank you so much. Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw, co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum, and the newly released hashtag Say Her Name, Black Women's Stories of Police Violence and Public Silence.
So one of the justifications given for purging intersectionality from the College Board's course was that the framework had been so distorted and politicized that it was no longer useful. There are 5,000 people who've signed a petition saying, useful to whom? Who gets to decide whether a framework is useful? The book that the African American Policy Forum has put together lifts up the stories of family members who are survivors of Black women who've been killed by the police. It uses intersectional framework to tell the story of both their vulnerability to police violence and their marginalization in movements and in discourse about anti-Black police violence. And you probably have not heard of their stories. And one of the reasons why is that our frameworks for holding social phenomena often are not intersectional. So when we think of violence against women, we don't think about police violence. Or when we think about police violence, we don't think about Black women. That's an intersectional problem. So first of all, I want to honor the mothers, sisters, and daughters who are here with us today, who are featured in this book. I'm really pleased to introduce Valerie Carey, Gina Bass, Sharon Wilkerson, and Chelsea Rubin, who are joining us for Mother's Weekend. When we say that certain ideas are illegitimate, we are saying the stories that have come to life through those ideas are not worth us fighting for. And I cannot sit with that erasure. And so Say Her Name is the evidence of the idea that ideas bring certain experiences to life. If we can't name them, we can't fight against them. So we know what the objective of the other side is. They don't want us fighting for those. For those of us who believe in racial justice, we believe in the intersection of racial justice with other forms of justice, we can't step aside and let this censorship dictate what we can see, what we can know, and what we can demand be transformed in our society. If we give up on our ideas, we're giving up on our lives. And that cannot be what we've inherited from 2020.
In my book, Race Brave New and Selected Works, when Black Lives Matter began and I looked at my 10-year-old and my 12-year-old, I realized I could not do work in the historical archives if I could not carve out a world where my boys can get home safely. That's when I became the Black Mommy activist, and my boys and I traveled the country. I would pull them out of school and inform their teacher they need to learn what it means to be a Black man in America and how to navigate this society and do it from the ground up. And Race Brave is my everyday experience of writing to them about this experience, about how do they navigate this world and understand who they are in light of a system that wants to define them and keep them oppressed and cut out their tongues. So I want to thank our panelists for guiding us, and I want to thank all of you for joining us in this important conversation. As we close on this segment, we have 3 invitations for you, because AAPF likes to give people stuff. We have 3 things for you. We want to invite you to join us for the book signing, have an opportunity to be in discussion with us about our work. 2, we are hosting an Artivism after party. It's called Books Unbanned, a night of artivism. Come and party with a purpose. Music, performances, poetry, song, starting tonight at 6:30.
And food.
All in the theme. We got food, always food, good food. All in the theme of freedom to learn. You can find us at 81 Willoughby Street on the 7th floor, which is just 6 minutes away. 6 minutes, y'all, 6 minutes. Come and join us as we party with a purpose. And finally, we'd like to ask you to join us in pushing back against censoring Black studies. Join us with the Freedom to Learn Coalition. We meet monthly. Our next meeting is coming up on this Thursday, October 5th, 2023. We can give you the information. Folks, I look forward to seeing you at the party. I will leave the light on for you. Thank you.
And thanks to our wonderful host, Kaye Wise Whitehead.